There's a question that has haunted governments, scientists, and ordinary people for over 70 years, and it goes something like this. Is it possible to reach inside a person's mind, take apart who they are, and rebuild them into someone else entirely? The answer, as you're about to hear, is more terrifying than any of us would like to admit. These are the most disturbing true cases of mind control and brainwashing ever documented. It started, as so many dark chapters in modern history tend to, with a war. Not just any war, but one that seemed to shatter the very foundation of what Americans believed about the resilience of the human mind. In the early 1950s, the Korean War was grinding through its second and third brutal years, and American soldiers were being captured by Chinese and North Korean forces in staggering numbers. Roughly 7,200 American servicemen ended up in prisoner of war camps along the Yalu River, pushed into crowded, freezing compounds where starvation and disease picked off men by the dozens. But it wasn't the cold or the hunger that truly frightened the United States government. It was what started coming out of those camps. American soldiers, men trained in discipline and duty, began appearing on Chinese and North Korean radio broadcasts. They read statements denouncing the United States and its allies. They confessed to participating in germ warfare against Korean civilians, something the U.S. government flatly denied had ever happened. Colonel Frank Schwabel, the highest-ranking American officer captured during the war, delivered a lengthy, detailed false confession admitting to the use of biological weapons. Back home, the American public was shocked. How could trained military men, some of them career officers, say such things? How could they betray their country so completely? When the armistice finally came in 1953 and the prisoners were released, the situation only grew stranger. 21 American soldiers refused to come home. They chose, voluntarily it seemed, to stay behind with their Chinese captors. Among them were men like Corporal Clarence Adams, a young African-American soldier from Memphis who had endured racial discrimination his entire life and found the Chinese rhetoric about American inequality uncomfortably persuasive. There was also Corporal Edward Dickinson, who initially refused repatriation before changing his mind at the last moment and coming home, only to face a court-martial. The press dubbed the 21 men turncoats, but the reality was far more complicated than that simple label suggested. Some were disillusioned with America. Some had been so thoroughly worked over by months of psychological pressure that they could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the ones that had been planted. And some were simply terrified of what would happen to them if they went home. That number might sound small, but the psychological shockwave it sent through the country was enormous. If 21 men could be turned, how many others had been compromised? How many came home with communist ideas quietly planted in their heads like seeds waiting to sprout? The military convened special review boards to study the phenomenon, and the results painted a troubling picture. An estimated 1 in 3 American prisoners had collaborated with the enemy in some way, whether by signing petitions, making broadcasts, or informing on fellow prisoners. The collaboration wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as attending a study group or accepting a small gift. But the cumulative effect was devastating to American morale and to the nation's understanding of its own psychological resilience. The Chinese called their program for the prisoners lenient policy. It sounded almost gentle, and in some ways, it was designed to. The approach was different from the outright physical torture the North Koreans had used in the early stages of the war. Instead, the Chinese system was methodical, patient, and deeply psychological. It began with isolation. Prisoners were separated from their units, stripped of their rank, and placed in environments where the traditional military hierarchy couldn't function. Without leadership, without the structure they knew, many soldiers became disoriented and vulnerable. Then came the indoctrination. Hours upon hours of lectures about Marxism, about the evils of American capitalism, about how the war was an act of imperialist aggression. It wasn't a single overwhelming assault on the mind, but a slow, relentless drip. Prisoners were organized into small study groups and encouraged to discuss what they had learned. They were asked to write essays about their feelings toward the war. A soldier might be asked to jot down just one small thing he didn't like about America. It could be anything, even something as harmless as complaining about the weather. But once that essay was written, it could be read aloud, broadcast, or used as leverage to push the prisoner further. Psychologist Robert Cialdini later described how the Chinese exploited what he called the principle of commitment. Once a man had written even a mildly critical statement, he was more likely to see himself as someone who held those views. It was a tiny crack in the armor, and the Chinese were experts at widening it. Compliance was rewarded with extra food, better sleeping arrangements, or the social approval of the group. Resistance was punished not with beatings necessarily, but with isolation, public humiliation, or the withdrawal of the small comforts that made life in the camps bearable. Over time, the classifications assigned by the Chinese became their own form of control. Prisoners who cooperated were labeled progressives. Those who resisted were called reactionaries. And among the prisoners themselves, these labels carried enormous social weight. Being a progressive could mean the difference between getting through the day with a little extra rice or spending weeks in a freezing isolation cell. When the war ended and the prisoners began to come home, they were met not with parades, but with suspicion. Military intelligence officers interrogated them for weeks aboard the transport ships crossing the Pacific. The FBI opened files on returning soldiers. Some men were court-martialed for collaboration. The American public, gripped by the fear of communism that defined the era, looked at these returning prisoners and saw something deeply unsettling. They saw men whose minds had been tampered with, and they needed a word for what had happened. That word was brainwashing. Coined by journalist Edward Hunter in 1950, the term was borrowed from the Chinese concept of thought reform. It captured the public imagination instantly and became the defining fear of the Cold War era. If the communists had found a way to reprogram human beings, then no one was safe. Not soldiers, not diplomats, not even ordinary citizens. And it was this fear, this consuming paranoia about what the enemy might be capable of, that led the United States government down one of the darkest paths in its history. Because while the American public was reading newspaper headlines about brainwashed soldiers, the Central Intelligence Agency was asking a very different question. The question wasn't how to protect Americans from brainwashing. It was whether the CIA could learn to do it better than anyone else. In the spring of 1953, just months before the Korean armistice, CIA Director Allen Dulles stood before an audience at Princeton University and delivered a speech about what he called brain warfare. He spoke of the Soviet threat, of sinister techniques that could strip a man of his free will, and of the urgent need for America to understand and counter these methods. 3 days later, Dulles approved a top-secret program that would become one of the most infamous and illegal operations in American intelligence history. Its codename was MKUltra, and at its helm was a man named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a chemist by training, a stutterer with a clubfoot who seemed an unlikely architect of horror. He had earned his doctorate from the California Institute of Technology and had joined the CIA's Technical Services Division, where he quickly became fascinated with the potential of psychoactive drugs. To Gottlieb, LSD, which had been discovered just a decade earlier by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, represented the holy grail of intelligence work. Here was a substance that could dissolve a person's sense of reality, make them suggestible, compliant, even terrified. If its effects could be harnessed, it might be possible to extract confessions from enemy agents, incapacitate hostile leaders, or perhaps even create the ultimate weapon of espionage, a human being whose mind had been wiped clean and reprogrammed to follow orders. With Dulles' approval and an initial budget of $300,000, Gottlieb set to work. He arranged for the CIA to purchase the entire world supply of LSD for $240,000, roughly $4 million in today's money, and he began funneling the drug to hospitals, prisons, universities, and military installations across the country. Over the next decade, MKUltra would grow into a sprawling empire of at least 149 separate subprojects, spanning behavioral modification, drug testing, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and methods of psychological torture. More than 80 institutions were involved, including some of the most prestigious universities in America. Columbia University, Stanford, Harvard, and the University of Chicago all received CIA funding through a web of front organizations designed to obscure the true source of the money. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, and the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation all served as conduits, laundering taxpayer dollars into programs that no congressional oversight committee had ever approved. At Georgetown University, the CIA contributed $375,000 toward the construction of a new medical facility, the Gorman Annex, in exchange for access to 1/6 of the building as a hospital safe house where human subjects could be tested. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a doctor named Harris Isbell kept African American inmates on LSD for 77 consecutive days, doubling and tripling the doses to overcome tolerance. The men were rewarded with heroin for their participation, and the test subjects, the people upon whom these experiments were carried out, were often chosen precisely because they had no power to resist. They were prisoners, drug addicts, mental patients, and in some cases, people who had absolutely no idea they were being experimented on at all. The scope of MKUltra was staggering, and yet most of its records were deliberately destroyed. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms, anticipating the congressional investigations that were beginning to close in, ordered Sidney Gottlieb to shred every file related to the program. Gottlieb complied. Thousands of documents were fed through the shredders, and an entire history of human experimentation was reduced to confetti. It was only by accident that any records survived at all. A cache of roughly 20,000 documents had been misfiled in a financial records building and was discovered during a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. Those surviving pages, incomplete as they were, revealed enough to horrify the nation. But even within the nightmarish landscape of MKUltra, there were certain episodes that stood apart for their sheer horror. And one of the most haunting of all involved a man named Frank Olson. Frank Rudolph Olson was a 43-year-old Army biochemist who worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the nerve center of America's biological weapons research. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, a husband and father of 3 who spent his days developing what were euphemistically called special materials for the CIA. He knew about MKUltra. He was, in fact, one of the few dozen people in the entire country who understood its true scope, and that knowledge, ultimately, may have cost him his life. On the evening of November 19, 1953, Olson attended a retreat at a remote cabin in the woods of Maryland. The gathering was arranged by Gottlieb himself, and the attendees were a mix of CIA officials and Army scientists involved in the most sensitive corners of biological warfare and mind control research. At some point during the evening, Gottlieb laced a bottle of Cointreau liqueur with LSD and served it to the group. Olson and several of his colleagues drank without knowing what had been slipped into their glasses. The effects hit quickly. For most of the men, the experience was disorienting but temporary. For Olson, it was devastating. He returned home the next day a changed man. His wife Alice noticed it immediately. He was distant, withdrawn, and unable to engage with his family. He pushed his food around his plate at dinner. He couldn't focus. He couldn't sleep. At one point, he looked at his wife and blurted out a single, cryptic sentence that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I've made a terrible mistake." In the days that followed, Olson grew increasingly agitated. He told his supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruitt, that he wanted to quit, that he couldn't continue with the work. Gottlieb arranged for Olson to see a doctor in New York, a man named Harold Abramson, who was himself connected to MKUltra. But whatever treatment was offered, it wasn't enough. On the morning of November 28, 1953, at approximately 2 a.m, Frank Olson crashed through the closed window of his 10th floor room at the Hotel Statler in New York City and plummeted to his death on the sidewalk below. He was wearing nothing but his undershirt and shorts. The official ruling was suicide. The CIA told Olson's family that he had suffered a nervous breakdown. Alice Olson and her children spent more than 2 decades believing that their husband and father had simply lost his mind and jumped. It wasn't until 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission investigating CIA abuses revealed the existence of MKUltra, that the Olson family finally learned the truth. Frank had been secretly dosed with LSD 9 days before his death. The family was invited to the White House, where President Gerald Ford personally apologized, and the CIA offered a settlement of $750,000. But the family's eldest son, Eric Olson, never accepted the suicide explanation. In 1994, he had his father's body exhumed for a second autopsy. The forensic pathologist found evidence of a blow to the head that had occurred before the fall, evidence that didn't match the pattern of someone crashing through a window voluntarily. Eric spent decades pursuing the theory that his father had been murdered, that the CIA had killed him because he knew too much about the darkest corners of MKUltra, including the use of biological weapons in Korea and the torture and execution of subjects at secret detention sites in Europe. In 1996, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office opened an investigation into Olson's death, but it was closed without charges in 1999. The Olson family filed a lawsuit against the CIA, but it was dismissed in 2012 on procedural grounds. Eric Olson devoted essentially his entire adult life to finding out what really happened to his father, sacrificing his own career as a clinical psychologist in the process. He once described the experience as being trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every new piece of evidence raised more questions than it answered. The CIA's own internal documents, the fragments that survived Gottlieb's shredding campaign, contained references to terminal experiments and disposal problems that hinted at something far darker than accidental overdoses. A 1953 memo from the CIA Inspector General acknowledged that the agency's unwitting testing program carried an inherent danger of serious harm to the subjects, and that the risks of negative publicity were substantial, but recommended continuing the experiments anyway. To this day, the full truth about Frank Olson's death remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Cold War. What is not a mystery, however, is the fact that the CIA was willing to dose its own people with mind-altering drugs and then cover up the consequences when things went horribly wrong. And Olson's death, as tragic as it was, barely scratched the surface of what Gottlieb and his operatives were willing to do. Perhaps nowhere was the depravity of MKUltra more brazenly on display than in a program that carried the darkly absurd codename Operation Midnight Climax. Launched in 1954 under the supervision of a federal narcotics agent named George Hunter White, Midnight Climax was an operation so outlandish that it sounds like the plot of a bad spy novel, except that every word of it is true. White was a colorful and morally unencumbered figure, a hard-drinking, bull-necked former journalist turned drug enforcement agent who had no qualms about the ethical boundaries his new assignment would require him to cross. His job, as given to him by Gottlieb, was to set up a network of CIA-run safe houses that would function as observation posts for studying the effects of LSD on unsuspecting subjects. The primary safe house was an apartment at 225 Chestnut Street on San Francisco's Telegraph Hill. White furnished it to look like an upscale French brothel, decorating the walls with Toulouse-Lautrec prints, photographs of can-can dancers, and images of women in provocative poses. Behind one wall, he installed a large two-way mirror. On the observation side, he kept a portable toilet, a small refrigerator, and a pitcher of martinis. The plan was simple and grotesque. Prostitutes, paid $100 per client, were sent out to bars in the North Beach neighborhood to pick up men and lure them back to the apartment. Once inside, the men would be served drinks that had been secretly laced with LSD. While the unsuspecting targets tripped on acid and engaged with the sex workers, White and other CIA operatives sat behind the two-way mirror, watching, taking notes, and recording everything through microphones disguised as electrical outlets. The stated goal was to determine whether the combination of sex and drugs could make a person more susceptible to interrogation, more willing to reveal secrets. The women were coached to ask probing questions at specific points during the evening, to test when a man might be most vulnerable to having his guard lowered. But the scientific rigor of the operation was virtually non-existent. There were no proper controls, no consistent methodology, and no clear research design. What there was, in abundance, was voyeurism, substance abuse, and a staggering contempt for the rights and dignity of the men who walked through that door. Over time, Midnight Climax expanded beyond the original apartment. Additional safe houses were opened in the Mill Valley area and in New York City's Greenwich Village. CIA operatives began dosing people not just in the brothels, but in restaurants, at bars, and even on public beaches. When drugs were considered too dangerous to test on agency personnel, they were sent to San Francisco for testing on civilians. One former agent later told journalist John Marks, "If we were scared enough of a drug not to try it out on ourselves, we sent it to San Francisco." The program ran for roughly a decade before the CIA Inspector General, a man named John Ehrman, discovered its existence in 1963 and recommended shutting it down. Ehrman's report was scathing. He noted that the program had no proper scientific oversight, that its methods were ethically indefensible, and that the potential for public embarrassment was enormous. The San Francisco safe houses were closed by 1965, and the New York operation followed in 1966. But the legacy of Midnight Climax extended far beyond the walls of those apartments. Some historians have argued that the widespread, uncontrolled distribution of LSD by the CIA during the 1950s and early 1960s played a direct role in sparking the psychedelic counterculture of the following decade. Author Ken Kesey, whose novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest became a touchstone of the era, first encountered LSD as a volunteer in a government-funded experiment at the Menlo Park Veterans Administration Hospital, an experiment that was itself a subproject of MKUltra. Kesey went on to become one of the most prominent advocates for psychedelic drugs in America, hosting the famous acid tests that helped launch the San Francisco hippie movement. The irony was extraordinary. A CIA program designed to develop weapons of mind control had inadvertently helped create a countercultural revolution that challenged the very authority the agency existed to protect. George Hunter White retired that same year and died in 1975, taking most of his secrets with him. But before he did, he left behind one final remark that perhaps sums up the spirit of Midnight Climax better than anything else. In a letter discovered after his death, White wrote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Those are not the words of a paraphrased account. That is exactly what he wrote. While Midnight Climax was playing out in San Francisco, another arm of MKUltra was operating across the border in Canada, and what was happening there made even the brothel experiments look restrained by comparison. At the Allan Memorial Institute, a psychiatric teaching hospital affiliated with McGill University in Montreal, a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Donald Ewen Cameron was conducting experiments that would later be described as among the most brutal and devastating acts of medical abuse in modern history. Cameron was not some fringe figure. He was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. He had served as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, had been president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and had even been invited to evaluate the mental fitness of Rudolf Hess at the Nuremberg trials. His reputation was impeccable, and it was precisely this veneer of respectability that made what he did all the more monstrous. Cameron believed that mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, could be cured by essentially erasing a patient's existing mind and starting over. His method was a two-stage process. The first stage, which he called depatterning, involved destroying a patient's existing personality and memories. The second stage, which he called psychic driving, involved implanting new thoughts and behaviors into the blank canvas that remained. What this looked like in practice was nothing short of torture. Patients who came to the Allan Memorial Institute seeking help for conditions like depression, anxiety, or even something as common as postpartum sadness were instead subjected to treatment regimes that no reasonable person could describe as medical care. Cameron placed patients into drug-induced comas using massive doses of barbiturates and a powerful neuroleptic called thorazine. These artificial comas were supposed to last a few days. In many cases, they lasted weeks. In one documented case, a patient was kept unconscious for 86 days. While the patients lay in their chemically induced stupor in what the staff called the sleep room, They were subjected to repeated rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, far beyond anything considered safe or normal. Where a standard course of electroshock might involve a few sessions, Cameron administered it up to 3 times a day, with voltage levels that were significantly higher than conventional practice. The goal was to induce a state of total amnesia, to strip away everything that made the patient who they were. And alongside the drugs and the shocks, Cameron deployed his signature technique, psychic driving. Patients were fitted with headphones, sometimes a football helmet clamped over their skull, and forced to listen to taped messages played on a continuous loop. These messages could be negative, things like, "My mother hates me," or "I am a terrible person," or they could be designed to implant new beliefs and behaviors. The tapes would play for 16 hours a day, sometimes for weeks on end. A single message might be repeated hundreds of thousands of times. The results were catastrophic. Rather than curing schizophrenia, Cameron's methods destroyed the minds of people who had never been seriously ill in the first place. Patients emerged from treatment unable to recognize their own families, unable to remember their names, unable to control basic bodily functions. Some had to relearn how to walk, how to speak, how to feed themselves. Many never recovered. The damage was permanent. Families described receiving back someone who was fundamentally no longer the person they had known. One patient recalled being unable to remember anything about her life for 2 years after treatment. Another forgot his children and how to run the business he had managed for decades. Cameron himself seemed oddly detached from the human cost of his work. After one particularly grueling experiment, he noted in his clinical records that, although the patient was prepared by both prolonged sensory isolation of 35 days and by repeated depatterning, and although she received 101 days of positive driving, no favorable results were obtained. There was no remorse in that notation, no acknowledgement that he had just spent more than 3 months systematically dismantling a human being's mind for nothing. He simply moved on to the next patient. Cameron also experimented with a radio telemetry laboratory that he had built under his direction at the Institute, where patients were exposed to electromagnetic signals and monitored for changes in behavior. The results, according to the records that survived, showed that none of the patients subjected to the radio telemetry lab demonstrated any signs of improvement. In 1980, the Canadian investigative program, The Fifth Estate, interviewed 2 former patients who were among several suing the CIA for the long-term effects of Cameron's treatment. Their testimony was devastating. These were people who had walked into the Allan Memorial Institute as functioning adults and walked out as shadows, unable to piece together even the most basic fragments of who they had once been. In 1957, the CIA began secretly funding Cameron's work through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Over the next 7 years, the agency funneled $69,000 to the Allan Memorial Institute, and the Canadian government contributed an additional $500,000. Cameron himself may never have known that his funding came from the CIA, though this remains debated. He continued his experiments until 1964, when the CIA funding was cut off. He died of a heart attack in 1967, never facing any consequences for what he had done. It wasn't until the late 1970s, when congressional investigations brought MKUltra to light, that Cameron's victims began to understand what had really happened to them. In the 1980s, several former patients sued the CIA, eventually settling for $750,000, the maximum allowed under the law. The Canadian government separately compensated some victims. but many were left with nothing but the shattered remnants of the lives Cameron had stolen from them. Among the countless men and women who were swept up in MKUltra's experiments without their knowledge or consent, one name stands out for the sheer improbability of his story. James Whitey Bulger would go on to become one of the most feared crime bosses in American history, a man responsible for at least 11 murders who terrorized the city of Boston for more than 2 decades. But before he became a monster, he was a young inmate in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, serving time for bank robbery. And it was there, in the late 1950s, that the CIA found him. Bulger was 26 years old when he volunteered for what he was told was a medical research program aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. In exchange for his participation, he was promised a reduced sentence. It seemed like a reasonable deal, a chance to do something useful while shaving time off his punishment. What Bulger didn't know was that the program had nothing to do with treating schizophrenia. It was a subproject of MKUltra, and the real purpose was to study the long-term effects of high doses of LSD on human subjects. Over a period of roughly 15 months, Bulger was dosed with LSD at least 50 times. The sessions were accompanied by repetitive questioning, the same questions asked over and over again for hours while the drug tore apart his sense of reality. According to letters he later wrote to a juror named Janet Ular, the experiences were devastating. He described horrible LSD experiences followed by thoughts of suicide and deep depression. He wrote about hallucinations so vivid that he saw blood running down the walls of his cell and watched the faces of fellow inmates transform into skeletons before his eyes. He said he saw a camera change into the head of a dog. He described being consumed by paranoia and violent urges. In a notebook discovered years later, Bulger compared the doctor who ran the program to a modern-day Dr. Mengele, a reference to the infamous Nazi physician. He wrote, "I was in prison for committing a crime and feel they committed a worse crime on me." The hallucinations and nightmares followed Bulger for the rest of his life. He wrote to Ular that he had not slept soundly in 60 years, that every night was filled with violent nightmares that caused him to wake every hour or two, drenched in sweat. He described auditory and visual hallucinations that never fully went away. When Ular, who had been one of 12 jurors to convict Bulger in 2013, learned about his involvement in MKUltra, she expressed deep regret over her decision. She told the Associated Press that had she known about the experiments, she would have held off on the murder charges. "He didn't murder prior to the LSD," she said. "His brain may have been altered, so how could you say he was really guilty?" Whether the LSD truly transformed Bulger from a petty criminal into a violent killer is a question that can never be definitively answered. Bulger himself was beaten to death by fellow inmates in 2018, at the age of 89, shortly after being transferred to a federal prison in West Virginia. He died in a wheelchair, still haunted by what the CIA had done to him more than 6 decades earlier. The techniques that MKUltra attempted to perfect in government labs and prison cells did not remain locked behind classified doors forever. The principles of coercive persuasion, isolation, sleep deprivation, information control, and the systematic dismantling of personal identity found their way into the hands of individuals who wielded them not in the name of national security, but in pursuit of something far more personal: absolute power over other human beings. And perhaps no one in modern American history demonstrated the devastating potential of these techniques more effectively than a charismatic preacher from Indiana named Jim Jones. Jones was born in 1931 in the small town of Crete, Indiana, to a family that was, by most accounts, dysfunctional. His father was an absentee alcoholic, and his mother worked long hours to support the family. The young Jim Jones was drawn to the church from an early age, not necessarily out of genuine faith, but because he recognized in religion a powerful tool for commanding the attention and devotion of others. By the time he was in his 20s, Jones had founded his own congregation, the People's Temple, which he initially ran out of Indianapolis. He preached a message of racial equality, social justice, and communal living that attracted a diverse following, particularly among African Americans who were drawn to his passionate advocacy for civil rights at a time when much of America remained violently segregated. But beneath the surface of his progressive message, Jones was building something far more sinister, a system of total control that operated according to what psychologist Robert J. Lifton would later categorize as the 8 criteria of thought reform. Jones controlled the flow of information to his followers with surgical precision. Members were discouraged or outright forbidden from consuming outside media. Television, radio, newspapers, and books were restricted or replaced with materials produced by the temple itself. Jones dictated what his followers could see, read, and hear, ensuring that the only version of reality they encountered was the one he constructed for them. He also demanded confession. Members were encouraged to publicly disclose their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets, their hidden desires. This served a dual purpose. It created an atmosphere of radical vulnerability within the group, and it provided Jones with an arsenal of personal information that could be weaponized against anyone who stepped out of line. Public shaming sessions, sometimes lasting for hours, were a regular feature of temple life. Members who had displeased Jones were brought before the congregation and berated, humiliated, and sometimes physically beaten while the others watched. Jones maintained his grip on the temple through a combination of rewards and punishments that grew steadily more extreme over time. Loyal followers received praise, responsibility, and a sense of belonging. Those who questioned Jones faced isolation, public humiliation, or worse. As the temple grew and eventually relocated to California, Jones's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He began claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, of Buddha, of Lenin. He staged fake healings, using chicken livers and other props to convince his followers that he could cure cancer and other diseases through divine power. He controlled who slept with whom, often insisting that he was the only man in the temple who was not homosexual, and using his sexual relationships with both male and female members as tools of domination and control. By 1977, amid growing scrutiny from journalists and government officials, Jones made the decision that would seal the fate of more than 900 people. He ordered a mass migration of temple members to a settlement he had constructed in the jungle of Guyana, a small country on the northern coast of South America. He called it Jonestown, and it was, in every sense, a prison disguised as a paradise. Members worked grueling hours in tropical heat, clearing jungle, tending crops, and building structures in conditions that would have broken most people within days. They were fed meager rations of rice and beans, sometimes supplemented with gravy made from whatever the kitchen could scrounge, while Jones himself dined on meat, eggs, and fresh fruit. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and members who attempted to leave were caught and punished. Passports were confiscated upon arrival. Jones had erected a system of informants within the community, encouraging members to report on one another's behavior, their conversations, their doubts. Children were sometimes used as informants against their own parents, Public address speakers mounted on poles throughout the compound broadcast Jones's sermons and announcements at all hours. There was no escape from his voice. Even sleep offered no refuge, as Jones would frequently call the community together for meetings that stretched deep into the night and sometimes until dawn. Sleep deprivation became one of Jones's most effective tools. According to Terry Buford O'Shea, one of the few people who managed to escape Jonestown before the end, Jones once said to her, "Let's keep them poor and tired, because if they're poor, they can't escape, and if they're tired, they can't make plans." Jones also conducted what he called white night drills, rehearsals for mass suicide in which members were given cups of liquid and told it was poison. Those who drank willingly were praised. Those who hesitated or refused were identified as potential security risks. These drills served to normalize the idea of collective death, to make the unthinkable feel almost routine. And on November 18, 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse and was subsequently murdered by Temple gunmen at a nearby airstrip, Jones gave the final order. The community gathered at the Central Pavilion, and vats of grape-flavored drink laced with cyanide and sedatives were prepared. A recording made during the final 45 minutes of Jonestown's existence, known as the death tape, captured Jones's voice urging his followers to drink. "Take our life from us," he said. "We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world." Parents administered the poison to their children first. 909 people died that day, including more than 300 children. Jones himself died of a gunshot wound to the head. It remains the largest mass murder-suicide in American history, and it stands as perhaps the most extreme example of what happens when the techniques of mind control are placed in the hands of a man with no moral boundaries. Just a few years before the horror of Jonestown, another case had already captured the American public's imagination and forced an uncomfortable national conversation about the limits of human willpower. On the night of February 4th, 1974, in a quiet apartment in Berkeley, California, a 19-year-old college student named Patricia Hearst was torn from her life in a way that no one could have predicted. Two men and a woman, armed with guns, burst through the door of the apartment she shared with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. They beat Weed severely and dragged Hearst out into the night, blindfolded and terrified, stuffing her into the trunk of a car. The kidnappers were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, a tiny, incoherent band of self-styled revolutionaries led by an escaped convict named Donald DeFreeze, who went by the name General Field Marshal Cinque. The SLA had fewer than a dozen members and no realistic political agenda, but they understood the power of spectacle. And by kidnapping the granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, they had guaranteed themselves the attention of the entire nation. For the first 57 days of her captivity, Hearst was kept blindfolded and bound inside a small closet. She was deprived of light, adequate food, and sleep. She was subjected to near-constant verbal assaults, with SLA members lecturing her for hours about their revolutionary ideology, about the evils of capitalism, and about the sins of her wealthy family. She was physically abused and sexually assaulted. DeFreeze told her that if she tried to escape, she would be killed. And throughout it all, the SLA worked to systematically dismantle her sense of identity and replace it with a new one that served their purposes. The process bore a striking resemblance to the techniques that had been documented in Korean War POW camps and studied by researchers like Robert J. Lifton. Hearst was isolated from every source of comfort and familiarity. Her captors controlled every aspect of her environment. They alternated between threats and moments of apparent kindness. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something in Hearst began to shift. On April 3, 1974, the SLA released a tape recording in which Hearst announced that she had joined their cause. She had taken a new name, Tanya, after the girlfriend of Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. She denounced her family and declared her allegiance to the revolution. 12 days later, security cameras inside the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco captured an image that would become one of the most iconic photographs of the 1970s. Patty Hearst, wielding an automatic rifle, helping her captors rob the bank. The image stunned the nation. Was she a victim or a willing participant? Had she been brainwashed, or had she simply chosen a new life? The question consumed the country for over a year as Hearst remained on the run with the remnants of the SLA. During that time, 6 SLA members, including DeFries, were killed in a televised shootout with police in Los Angeles on May 17, 1974. The house they were hiding in caught fire during the gun battle, and the bodies were pulled from the smoking ruins, while Hearst, who had been at a nearby safe house, watched the coverage on television. Rather than turning herself in after the group's near-total destruction, she remained underground with the surviving members, William and Emily Harris, and continued to participate in revolutionary activities. She was involved in a second bank robbery and was allegedly seen firing shots during a sporting goods store robbery in which the Harrises were caught shoplifting. When she was finally captured by the FBI in September 1975, her booking card listed her occupation as urban guerrilla. Her trial became a national spectacle. Her defense attorney, the famous F. Lee Bailey, argued that Hearst had been the victim of coercive persuasion, that the SLA had brainwashed her through the same techniques used on prisoners of war. He brought in experts, including psychiatrist Louis Jolyon West and psychologist Robert J. Lifton himself, who testified that Hearst's experience met all the criteria for thought reform. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney James Browning, countered that Hearst had willingly joined the SLA, that she had ample opportunities to escape and chose not to, and that the brainwashing defense was simply a rich girl's attempt to avoid responsibility. But the jury was not convinced by Bailey's arguments. They found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Hearst served 22 months before President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon on his last day in office. In a 2018 interview, Hearst spoke candidly about her captivity, describing the physical and emotional abuse, the sleep deprivation, and the systematic effort to destroy her sense of self. "They made me feel guilty and responsible for my own kidnapping," she said. Actor John Wayne, speaking in the wake of the Jonestown massacre, perhaps put the contradiction most clearly when he observed that the American public seemed perfectly willing to accept that Jim Jones had brainwashed 900 people into committing mass suicide, but could not accept that a small group of armed radicals might have brainwashed a kidnapped teenage girl. The question of where personal agency ends and external control begins has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and perhaps it never will be. But in the spring of 1997, a case emerged in the suburbs of San Diego, California, that pushed the concept of mind control to its absolute extreme and left the nation grappling with a form of brainwashing so thorough, so all-encompassing, that its victims willingly chose death as their graduation ceremony. Marshall Herff Applewhite was the son of a Presbyterian minister, a man who had grown up in Texas and pursued a career in music and education. He was, by all accounts, a talented singer and an engaging teacher. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary life, something was deeply troubled. In the early 1970s, after being fired from his position at St. Thomas University in Houston, under circumstances that remain partially unclear, Applewhite experienced a profound personal crisis. He was hearing voices, struggling with his sexuality, and drifting into depression. It was during this vulnerable period that he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse and mother of 4, who had a deep interest in astrology, theosophy, and the occult. Nettles told Applewhite that the voices in his head might be messages from beings on a higher plane, and that he was destined to be a divine teacher. Together, they developed a belief system that blended elements of Christianity, science fiction, and New Age mysticism into something entirely their own. In the early days, Applewhite and Nettles recruited followers from New Age bookshops, spiritual retreats, and college campuses. They held public meetings in which they claimed to be the 2 witnesses described in the Book of Revelation, sent to Earth to gather a chosen few before the planet's destruction. In 1975, they attracted national attention when 20 people from the small town of Waldport, Oregon, abandoned their families and possessions to follow the couple into the wilderness. The media ridiculed them. Families were frantic. But for those who had joined, the experience of being part of something larger than themselves, of being among the selected few who understood the true nature of reality, was intoxicating enough to override every objection from the outside world. They gave themselves new names. Applewhite became Do, and Nettles became T, names derived from the musical scale, reinforcing the idea that they operated on a frequency the rest of humanity could not perceive. They told their followers that human bodies were merely containers, vehicles for souls that originated on a higher level of existence. They taught that the earth was about to be recycled, destroyed, and rebuilt, and that the only way to survive was to shed one's human attachments, including family, possessions, sexuality, and ultimately the physical body itself, and ascend to the next level aboard a spacecraft. It sounded absurd to outsiders, but to the people who joined, many of whom were intelligent, educated, and searching for meaning in their lives, Applewhite's narrative offered something powerful: a sense of purpose, a feeling of being chosen, and the promise that the confusion and pain of human existence was temporary. Over the course of more than 2 decades, Applewhite refined his control over the group using techniques that echoed the methods of every coercive organization that came before him. He isolated his followers from the outside world, cutting them off from family, friends, and all sources of independent information. He dictated every aspect of their daily lives, from what they ate, to when they slept, to what they wore. Members lived communally, shared all possessions, and adhered to a strict code of celibacy. 8 members of the group, including Applewhite himself, voluntarily underwent castration as a means of eliminating sexual desire. The group earned money by designing websites under the business name Higher Source, a fact that would later strike many as deeply ironic given the technological sophistication of a group that held such otherworldly beliefs. When Bonnie Nettles died of cancer in 1985, Applewhite was devastated, and his theology shifted in a significant way. He had always taught that the group would physically ascend to the next level, but Nettles' death made physical ascension seem impossible. Gradually, he began to speak of death as the mechanism for transcendence, of leaving the human body behind as the final and necessary step. By the mid-1990s, the group, which had dwindled from several hundred members to just 39, was living in a rented mansion in the upscale community of Rancho Santa Fe outside San Diego. They were quiet, polite neighbors who kept to themselves and raised no suspicions. In early 1997, when the Comet Hale-Bopp became visible in the night sky, Applewhite seized upon a rumor circulating in New Age communities that a spacecraft was trailing behind the comet. He told his followers that this was the signal they had been waiting for, that T was aboard the ship, and that their time on Earth was finally over. Over the course of 3 days in late March, the 39 members of Heaven's Gate prepared for what they called their final exit. They donned matching black uniforms with patches that read Heaven's Gate Away Team, a reference to the television series Star Trek. They packed small overnight bags. Each member placed a $5 bill and a form of identification beside their bed. And then, in 3 carefully organized waves of 15, 15, and 9, they consumed a mixture of barbiturates and vodka, placed plastic bags over their heads, and lay down to die. They were found on March 26, 1997, each neatly tucked into bed, wearing identical Nike Decade shoes, their faces and upper bodies covered with purple diamond-shaped cloths. The discovery was made by a former member named Rio D'Angelo, who had received a package from the group containing farewell videotapes and a letter explaining that they had shed their containers and moved on to the next level. When police entered the mansion, the scene was eerily peaceful. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of coercion. The bodies were arranged in meticulous rows on bunk beds and mattresses throughout the house. The smell of decomposition was overwhelming, and officers initially believed they were looking at far more than 39 people because of the uniformity of the bodies. Applewhite was among the last to go. In their final videos, recorded before the suicides, the members appeared calm, even cheerful. They spoke of the excitement they felt about the journey ahead, about finally leaving behind the limitations of their human containers. Many had been with Applewhite for 20 years. They had given up their families, their careers, their names, and their identities. And in the end, they gave up their lives, not because a gun was held to their heads, but because a man had spent decades reshaping their understanding of reality so completely that death looked like freedom. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide remains the largest to ever occur on American soil, and it stands as a chilling reminder that mind control does not always look like torture or drugs or locked rooms. Sometimes it looks like a gentle, smiling teacher who tells you exactly what you want to hear, and piece by piece, year by year, takes apart who you are until there's nothing left but his voice inside your head. From government laboratories to jungle compounds, from hospital wards to quiet suburban mansions, the stories you've heard tonight share a single, uncomfortable truth. The human mind, for all its brilliance and resilience, can be bent, broken, and reshaped by those who understand its vulnerabilities. The defenses we take for granted, our sense of self, our ability to distinguish truth from manipulation, our belief that we would never fall for such things, these are far more fragile than any of us would like to believe. What connects the Chinese interrogation rooms along the Yalu River to the sleep room at the Allan Memorial Institute, what links the LSD-soaked brothels of San Francisco to the jungle pavilion in Guyana, is a single, devastating insight about human nature. We are social creatures, wired to seek approval, to conform, to trust authority, and to find meaning in the groups we belong to. Every case you've heard tonight exploited those instincts. The prisoners in Korea wanted to survive and to be accepted. Cameron's patients wanted to be healed. Bulger wanted a reduced sentence. The followers of Jim Jones wanted community and purpose. Patty Hearst wanted to stay alive. The members of Heaven's Gate wanted to believe that there was something more to existence than the ordinary, painful business of being human. None of them set out to lose their minds. None of them believed it could happen to them. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson of all. The people most vulnerable to these techniques are not the weak or the gullible. They are people who are searching for something, for truth, for belonging, for relief from pain. And there will always be someone ready to exploit that search. If you found this journey as unsettling and fascinating as I did, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for listening, and sleep well.